Thank you very much. I would like to thank very much Yanni Linden for this invitation and the organizers. I'm very glad to be here in this wonderful conference with a very interesting subject. Now, the title I've given, as you may see, is Aristotelian souls, what kind of entities are they? But I've given an alternative title which perhaps grasps better what I'm going to say. And the alternative title is Life as a Primitive Notion in Aristotle. So there's a handout with the text I will base my argument on. I'm not going to read the text, but I will refer to those texts while I speak. Even without the fundamental opposition between life and intellect that may reasonably be said to be a distinctive mark of modern philosophers of life, Aristotle is a philosopher of life, although of an ancient kind. To be a philosopher of life prior to the advent of modernity, of Cartesianism, means, for one, to approach things not from the perspective of the human subject, but of the cosmos as a whole, and for another, to see life as a fundamental and irreducible phenomenon of the universe. The thesis that I would like to defend in what follows is the claim that for Aristotle, life is a primitive notion, i.e. basic and inexplicable, that cannot be properly defined, since to define it would be to subsume it to a higher genus, and there is none such. In support of this claim, I bring forward Aristotle's belief that the first unmoved mover, the supreme substance of his universe, is, though disembodied, alive. Its distinct kind of being uninterrupted contemplation of itself as the highest object of thinking. If one were to define this supreme living thing, one would have to subsume it to a still higher kind of being, and there is none as such. Aristotle's considered view about substance also, I would claim, points in the same direction, the indefinability of life. Although in metaphysics delta 8, that's the first text on the handout, inanimate natural entities such as the so-called elements and the organic parts of plants and animals are said to be substances, in metaphysics zeta 16, the second text on the handout, Aristotle explicitly corrects his former view to the effect that only living things should count as substances. Elements are said to be powers and heaps, not substances sensu stricto, whereas vegetative and animal parts are not substances themselves, but only the parts of substances. When separated from the substances of which they were parts, they are only matter, or, as Aristotle says elsewhere in the De Anima, they are parts only in a homonymous sense. The upshot of my argument so far is that for Aristotle, only substances, whether embodied or disembodied, are alive, and all living things, whether embodied or disembodied, are substances. To be a substance and to be a living thing are unexceptionally coextensive ways of being in Aristotle's considered view about what counts as a substance. For Aristotle, a primary substance cannot be defined. It is only the essences of primary substances, or in the terminology of the categories, the secondary substances that can be defined. And the essences of primary substances are natural kinds and intellects in the definition of whom or which, as gods, animals, and plants, life is presupposed as a self-evident concept. From this, it follows that life is, if implicitly, a primitive and indefinable notion for Aristotle. But an obvious objection comes readily to mind. One may point to Aristotle's definition of the soul in De Anima 2:1 and regard it as a clear indication of the opposite being the case, the opposite of what I have so far argued. If Aristotle defines the soul, which is agreed on all hands to be the principle of life, then one may reasonably argue life is not, after all, so fundamental a notion of Aristotle's as I have taken it to be. The main bulk of the present paper aims to give a convincing answer to this objection. I will argue, first, that psyche is not the principle of all life, but only the principle of embodied life. And second, and more importantly, that Aristotle does not ever define the soul in any robust and full-blown sense of definition. He only gives a heuristically viable account or operational description of the soul, whereby one may identify a soul and see the signs of its activity in the ensouled body. Now, the first of my claims is rather easy to establish. When in the Metaphysics and elsewhere, Aristotle speaks of or alludes to disembodied living substances, he never calls them souls, although modern literature does often do so. If this is not a careless omission on his part, but a consequence of his considered view about what it is for something to be a soul, as I think it is, it follows that psyche, for Aristotle, is the principle of embodied life alone, that which animates a body in the sublunary world of nature, not the principle of life to occur. If so, then a universal definition of the soul, even if such a thing were possible, would not entail the consequent that life itself is definable. For if life extensionally exceeds the domain of souls, then the definition of soul, if it were possible, would not obviously count as an intentional account or definitional account of all life. I now move to the establishment of my second claim, namely that Aristotle does not ever define the soul in any rigorous sense of definition. I have deliberately opted for a roundabout rather than a straightforward way of proving my point. I have also included a hypothetical reconstruction of how the novel notion of entelechy, used for the heuristic account of the soul, came about. In the first chapter of the De Anima, Aristotle seeks to find out the nature and essence of the soul, as well as the attributes that belong to it. He admits, however, that, and this is basically text 3 of your handout, grasping anything trustworthy concerning the soul is completely and in every way among the most difficult of affairs. All the translations are provided by Christopher Shields of the De Anima. Aristotle then raises the question as to which of the ontological categories the soul belongs. Is it a todeti in the sense of substance, a quality, a quantity, or what? Moreover, does it belong to potential things, or is it some kind of entelechy, he says. After enumerating some further questions that an inquiry into the soul should raise, Aristotle returns to the issue of essence. He says that not only is it the case that knowledge of the essence is useful for understanding the causes of the attributes of substance, it is also the case that knowledge of the properties of the attributes contributes a great deal to the knowledge of essence. For the starting point of demonstration is the essence, i.e. the definition. From the outset, Aristotle seeks a universal definition of the soul, but he is very hesitant as to whether such a universal definition may be reached. In fact, he writes, and this is text 4 on your handout. And one must take care not to overlook the question of whether there is one account of soul as there is one account of animal, or whether there is a different account for each type of soul, For example, of horse, of dog, of man, of God, while the universal animal is either nothing or posterior to this. Now, Aristotle is well aware of the great difficulties involved in the effort of finding out a universal definition of the soul. If at the beginning of the second book he appears to be able to provide one such definition, this is a mere appearance, I would argue. What he provides is an answer to the question about the ontological category to which the soul belongs, it is a substance, as well as an answer to the question as to whether it is a potential thing or some kind of entelechy. It is the latter, but he does not provide a universal definition, as we shall see. In the rest of the first book of the De Anima, largely a book of reputed opinions and puzzlements about the soul, Aristotle claims that his predecessors discerned two characteristic marks of the soul: its power to move the body. I'm based on text number 5 on your handout. Its power to move the body and its capacity to perceive. He later adds, as if on second thought, text number 6, a third mark, incorporeality, in the sense of fine-grained material, something like that. According to Aristotle, the two basic characteristics of the soul were, for his predecessors, also characteristics of all or some of the basic elements or elements of their cosmologies. The pre-Aristotelian thinkers believed to have solved the problem of the origin of life by making, one way or another, already alive the matter out of which living things come to be. As I will try to show in what follows, Aristotle agrees that life should not be reduced to lifeless matter, nor should it be taken to be some emergent property, or even less probably an epiphenomenon of lifeless matter, when the latter achieves by chance a sufficiently complex structure. He disagrees, however, with his predecessors that the proper starting point for an inquiry into the nature of the soul is the assumption of the twin powers of locomotion and perception. These two marks do not characterize all living things, since they do not apply to plants. And this is text 7. A general theory of the soul should be wide enough to encompass all living things of the sublunary world, and not selectively some of them, be they those deemed highest. Now, in the first two chapters of the second book of the De Anima, Aristotle lays down his own view about the soul. Now, I'm giving the so-called definition, the third, actually, and definitive definition of the soul. He writes, and now I have my translation, although I print Chris Shield's translation. If we have to say something that applies equally to every soul, Aristotle writes, the soul would be the first entelechy of a natural body with organs. The first actuality of an organic natural body. You will see why I have not chosen Shield's translation at this instance. Several things should strike us in this definition, if we do not take it for granted from our previous knowledge of Aristotle. The first thing to strike us is the conditional mode in which the definition is introduced. The hypothesis, if we have to say something that applies equally to every soul, implies a sort of hesitation, as if Aristotle is not entirely sure that a strict definition is indeed possible. Our suspicion is strengthened in the following chapter, when Aristotle admits that, I have not included this text, living is said in many ways, polachos tousin legomeni, and enumerates several attributes such as thinking, perception, locomotion, nutrition, and growth, the presence of any one of which enables us to detect that something is alive. The second thing to strike us in the definition is the very concept of entelechy, a term that appears once in the first book, many times in the second, and a few in the third, but is conspicuously absent from all logical and ethical works. To be sure, The third thing to strike us, and come back to entelechy, is that Aristotle uses the body as part of the definitions. To be sure, he does not say that the soul is a body. He does say, however, and later he says even more explicitly, this is text 9, that the soul is an element or property of the body, or at any rate something that is essentially related to the body. Since the soul is the principle of life in the hylomorphic compound, one would expect the soul to be the thing by means of which the body is defined, not vice versa. The fourth thing to strike us in this definition is that the body, of which the soul is the first entelechy, is a natural body that already possesses organs. In the immediately preceding account of the soul, the notion of organs was absent. That is text number 10. There, Aristotle defined the soul, just before the definition, so-called definition that we have seen. There, Aristotle defined the soul as the first entelechy of a natural body that potentially possesses life, or, as Shields translates, which has life in potentiality. This definition, if not tautological and circular, is at best analytic and uninformative, since life, which is in fact part of the definiendum, to the extent that the soul is assumed to be the principle of life, appears in the definitions. If anything follows from this quasi-definition, is the fact that for Aristotle, life is indefinable. Life can only be described as an aggregate of some natural functions, the lowest of which, for something to be called alive, is, as we learned earlier on in the same chapter, nourishment, growth, and decay through itself. Self-nourishment, self-growth, and self-decay. Aristotle explains that a natural body that potentially possesses life is a natural body that has organs. He does not specify whether those organs should exist in full actuality or may themselves be potential organs. It stands to reason to assume, against the majority of interpreters, that a natural body that potentially possesses life is a natural body that can develop organs, not a natural body that already possesses fully developed organs. For if it has fully developed organs, the natural body in question should be actually, rather than potentially, alive. Thus, the necessary but not sufficient condition for something to have a soul is for this thing, first, to be a body, second, to be a product of nature rather than of human craftsmanship. This may say something about what Aristotle would say about artificial life or artificial intelligence, but this is a different subject. And third, to be in such a state as to have the passive capacity to host the development of organs. I have left the notion of entelechy for the end. Of all the things that should strike us in Aristotle's account of the soul, this is the most perplexing. The word, is clearly Aristotle's own coinage. It does not appear in the Organon or the ethical works, as I have already said. It is extremely rare in the biological treatises. It makes a few entrances, only the Generatione Animalium and the Partius Animalium. It shows up quite often in the physics, the Generatione et Corruptione, the Decelo and the Metaphysics, but its thickest presence by far is in the rather short De Anima, where it occurs 35 times. I suspect and suggest that Aristotle coined the word with a view to giving a heuristically viable account of the soul, and then extended its application to other domains. Quite often, entelechy is taken to be a synonym of form. Aristotle himself provides the ground for this identification when he writes, for instance, in the text 12, it is necessary then that the soul is a substance as the form of a natural body which has life in potentiality. But if we closely and carefully follow Aristotle's text, it becomes clear that Aristotle's syllogism moves from the concept of form to that of substance, and from the concept of substance to that of entelechy. This shows that entelechy is not a synonym of form. Moreover, entelechy does not mean form. The word is obviously a compound, and none of its components, whether two, enteles, echon, or three, en, telos, echon, means form. Entelechy is the state a thing is in, whenever it has its end within itself. In other words, whenever it does not need to search for its end outside itself. By calling the soul an entelechy, Aristotle implies that the soul is a fulfillment, a completion, and an intrinsic end. There is no doubt that entelechy is Aristotle's neologism, and it is reasonable to assume that a philosopher coins a new term when he wants to announce a novel idea that cannot be adequately expressed by means of the extant, technical, or non-technical vocabulary. What may have prompted Aristotle to coin the word entelechy will become clear once we see how Aristotle defined the soul prior to the coinage of the word. In his Tusculum Disputations, and this is text 13 on your handout, Cicero says that Aristotle, after accepting the four well-known elements, earth, water, air, and fire, from which everything comes to be, assumed that there is also a fifth nature from which mind comes. Aristotle ascribed to that unnamed fifth nature the functions of thinking and foreseeing, distinguishing, learning, discovering, remembering, loving, hating, feeling sorrow and joy, which he thought could not be explained by means of the four elements. Because of the presence of this fifth nature in it, Aristotle gave to the soul also a new name. He called it endelechia, endelecheia. Cicero says, writing the word in Greek, and he explains a sort of continual and perpetual movement, as if it were something like a continual and perpetual movement. Now the context clearly shows that Cicero has not confused, as some modern people, interpreters, scholars have said, has not confused endelechia with entelechia. For only endelechia, sorry for my pronunciation, but it's only the only way I can make sense of the difference by pronouncing the rather than the, although I know I cannot do it the other way. Otherwise, it sounds identical to my ears. So please bear with me. Only endelechia fits the explicit connection of the term with continuous and perpetual motion. The adverb endelechos and the adjective endeleches appears in the Generation and Corruptione 2:12. I have the passages on the handout, 14, text 14 and 15, to indicate the sublunary cycle of birth and perishing that is causally related to the annual revolution of the sun across the ecliptic. Moreover, only endelechia suits Cicero's so-called fifth nature, i.e. the equivalent of the first body of Aristotle's Decalo, for the perpetual, circular, and regular motion of which Aristotle provides specific arguments in the first book of that treatise. Unlike entelechia, endelechia is not Aristotle's coinage. A fragment of the 5th century BC epic poet Kyrillos of Samos reads, and this is text 16, a drop of water hollows a rock with persistence, or more literally, ceaselessness. Now, Cicero's source was Aristotle's published dialogue on philosophy, now lost. The dialogue, what we know about the dialogue, bears witness to an intermediate stage of Aristotle's philosophical development. On the one hand, Aristotle clearly rejects Plato's theory of forms in that dialogue to the very extent that forms are identified with ideal numbers. On the other, he holds fast to the Platonic belief that the human soul is something immortal and akin to the nature of the gods. Now, if Aristotle had indeed called the soul endelechia in this dialogue, the step to the coinage of a new term appears to have been rather small. With the simple substitution of a tau for a delta, phonetically a very slight change, a new meaning would suddenly pop up. The soul would no longer be a movement, be it continuous and eternal, it would turn up into a complete end. On the above reconstruction, Aristotle was led to the conception of the soul as entelechia when he overcame his early adherence to the Platonic view of the soul as separable from the body. As a Platonist, Aristotle had himself called the separable soul endelechia to show its relation to the celestial field, the perpetual motion of the heavenly bodies, and their entirely different material constitution from the stuff that makes up the bodies of the sublunary realm. At a later stage, when he was already disillusioned about the separability of the soul from the body, he seems to have realized that by changing a single letter of the word, he might radically change the meaning. The term he had given to the soul should not be abandoned. It should be slightly modified for an entirely different sense to emerge out of it. I suggest that Aristotle coined the word entelechia on the model of endelechia as soon as he rejected the possibility of a postmodern existence of the soul, which the latter term logically implied. I do not mean that the term etymologically comes from endelechia, as Hirzel has suggested, since the two words do not have the slightest etymological connection with one another. Endelechia comes from endelechos ekon, whereas endelechia comes from endelechis. But I do suggest that Aristotle coined the new term as a substitute for the old term in a conscious attempt at self-correction. Now the soul does not exist without the body. Aristotle is crystal clear about that in the De Anima. Apart from the intellect, I'm not going to enter that, into that topic at all. Now, however, from this genuinely Aristotelian doctrine that the soul is not separable from the body, interpreters often derive, it seems to me, a non-Aristotelian consequence. A rather widespread interpretative strategy proceeds from the correct admission that the soul is the first fulfillment or completion of the body, and as such, inseparable from the body, to the erroneous conclusion that the soul must be an emergent property or an epiphenomenon of the body. In other words, scholars tend to think that an Aristotelian soul derives its being from the body. This conclusion is, to my mind, a misconstrual, if not an outright reversal of Aristotle's view. Its defenders are forced to admit that Aristotle's considered view about the soul does not greatly differ from the idea that the soul is the attunement of the body, which Simmias defends in Plato's Phaedo, and which Aristotle knows and criticizes in the first book of the De Anima. An Aristotelian soul is not the attunement of a body. This is hell, a quality of a body. The soul is said to be substance, something much prior to the polarity of health and sickness, since it is only a living body that may be healthy or sick. The soul is, and now I basically draw on chapter 4 of the second book of the Anima. This is a long quotation from this book under text number 17. The soul is the efficient cause that turns a natural body that has the potentiality to develop organs into a body with organs. It is the formal principle of the body's organization and unity, as well as the final cause of the body's end, that for the sake of which the body exists. A natural body with organs exists for the sake of the soul. It is such as it is for the sake of the soul. It possesses the organ that it possesses for the sake of the soul. When the organs grow old and are no longer able to properly function, the soul does not wear out as a result of their deterioration. If an old man, and that's the last text on which I draw my interpretation, if an old man suffering from short-sightedness would get a new eye, he would see perfectly well, as he admits. The visual capacity of the soul, the visual capacity of the soul, the visual faculty of the soul, does not, though active only through the eye, does not lose its intrinsic power for sight when the eye is damaged or malfunctions. Aristotle says that the same holds for the soul as a whole in the same text. It is the body that ages. The soul does not grow old. But if the soul does not itself undergo the decline which the aging body suffers, how on earth does it depend on the body and is itself extinguished as soon as the body ceases to function at all? To anticipate what I will argue in the sequence, my answer is briefly that the soul does not in fact depend on the body. It acts on the body without being essentially affected by it. In Physics 2.1 and elsewhere, Aristotle uses the example of human craftsmanship in order to illustrate the much more complex workings of nature. Let us follow him. A statue is primarily its form. What we see and admire in marble or bronze is the form imparted to the material by the sculptor. The crude material, for us, is not a work of art. By carefully looking at the statue, say Praxiteles Hermes, we manage to sense the god's form that pre-existed in the artist's soul, as well as his or her technical expertise in transferring this form to the marble. The statue is not a piece of marble. It is the form of this particular piece that this particular piece of marble has as a consequence of its being carved in a certain way. When a finger or arm gets broken or lost, what is really lost is the part of the marble in which the form of the finger or arm was imparted. It is not the form as such that has changed. This is why we can still admire artifacts that have been preserved only fragmentarily. A damaged or lost material part does not really alter the form of the artifact, although it impedes, hinders, or even blocks the spectator's ability to come to know that form. In nature, where the principle of change is internal, and for Aristotle much more efficient and goal-directed than in the workings of art, the soul comes instantaneously into being, i.e. without a process of generation, as metaphysics Zeta 7 to 9 indicate, as soon as the essential form of a given species that is present in the male seed finds the appropriate female material to impart its form to. The essential form on its own is not yet a soul. A soul is what comes into being when the essential form finds the proximate matter on which it can act. A soul, therefore, is an essential form in a state of activity. And that is what I suggested, why Aristotle coined the word entelechi, to capture that idea. When that happens, the soul is at once generated and begins those processes that will transform the maternal stuff into homogeneous parts, such as flesh and bones, and organs, heart, lungs, whatever, leaves, each with its own function. At the same time, the generated soul harmonizes those functions into an integral system with a common goal and fully manufactures a fully grown body that is appropriate for the kind of life for which it is made. The soul does not undergo any kind of growth or development during this process. It is complete from the very beginning. It only becomes manifest and, as it were, externally visible and operative in the appropriate body. What really grows and develops is the body itself, and the body grows in accordance with the prescriptions and demands of the soul. The whole program of the body's growth and maturation is provided by the soul. Throughout this whole process of growth and development, the body is causally dependent on the soul, not vice versa. The final product, namely the mature and properly functioning body, has all the organs needed to lead the kind of life for which the soul made it in the first place. When one says that the soul is the fulfillment or completion or entelechy or actuality of the body, one may mean that the soul is the outcome of the proper function of the bodily parts, or at least the elementary function of some bodily part, because it's the first entelechy. But then obviously the soul is no longer the principle of life. The soul turns rather into a product, an emergent property or a phenomenon of the body. Alternatively, when one says that the soul is the first fulfillment, completion, or perfection of the body, one may mean that the soul is the starting point, the principle, the cause, and the sole efficient explanation of all the functions of the body, in the sense that all those functions cannot be reduced to the body as pure matter, but point to something incorporeal that, first, is inscribed in the body as its vital energy, integrity, and design, 2, causes the body's structure, and 3, determines its operation. The soul is the program of life that the body is called forth to lead. As Stephen Mann nicely has pointed out, and this is a quotation, merely calling the soul the form of the body is not enough to suggest such a program. Triangle is the form of the bronze triangle, but the bronze is not an organon of the triangle and need not be for the sake of the triangle. End of the quotation. The soul, by contrast, is not just the form, but the first entelechy of the body, which implies that the soul provides the body with all that is necessary for it to become active and to act in accordance with the program of action, i.e. the mode of life that it has been endowed with. By calling the soul the first entelechy of a natural body equipped with organs, Aristotle does not, strictly speaking, define the soul. He rather calls attention to the fact that embodied life naturally comes in as many varieties as the types of bodies of extant living things indicate. Now, the conclusion that I draw from the above arguments is that in Aristotle's thought, life is a primitive and indefinable notion throughout his philosophical career. In his Platonic phase, he considered life to be an inherent property of a very fine-grained, almost incorporeal stuff, which, unlike the four known elements that make up the gross material bodies, comes from the celestial region and is characterized by continuous and perpetual motion. In that phase, the soul was called endelechia. Remnants of this view came later to form his peculiar notion of pneuma as the analog of the element of the stars, which we find in the biological works but is conspicuously absent from the anima. In the last phase of his career, Aristotle approached life from a more empirical perspective, as a series of functions such as nutrition, growth, perception, and self-movement, which can be summed up in a general account, but not a definition of the soul as the first completion of a natural body with organs. His concept of the soul as the principle of life in sublunary bodies accordingly changed from being endelechia, continuous of perpetual motion, to being entelechia, completion and end. But this change of vocabulary and conception did not involve a revision about the being of life as such. Life remained as primitive and indefinable a notion as it was in the earlier phase. The change was grounded in the discovery that soul and body form an indissoluble unity, such that the soul is not separable from the body, and body of which it is, but it is essentially, the soul is essentially tied to the body, not contingently. Aristotle could now study life as a biologist does, from the perspective of empirical observations about the organs and functions of the bodies of the various natural kinds. Now the soul, the soul is the organizing principle of the program of life that each species leads, not the stuff that enters a lifeless body from without and animates it. Even so, life remains a primitive and unexplainable reality, or rather, a starting point of explanation that the human mind, itself a living substance, intuitively perceives.